once again, welcome everybody. We are very grateful and honored to be here this morning. My name is Jeremy Miller, and I am on the steering committee for the International People's Tribunal. We are having our country hearing today for the U.S. Virgin Islands. The International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism has been conducting a series of country hearings over the course of this last year, addressing the impacts of sanctions, blockades, and economic coercive measures on the peoples of the world. Today, we are having a very special hearing, and some may question this because unlike the majority of other countries, territories that we have held hearings on, the U.S. Virgin Islands are not directly sanctioned in proper terms by the United States or multilateral bodies such as the United Nations. And so I'd like to take a moment to explain our thinking here. We've come to understand these sanctions and economic coercive measures as a tool to maintain and expand imperial order for the powers that institute and implement them. They're used as a coercive instrument in the service of this and as an affront to the national sovereignty of the states that they are wielded against, as well as, of course, against the lives of the people within these states and territories. Now, when we deal with a case such as the U.S. Virgin Islands, we have a situation where the imperial center, as it were, in this case, the United States of America, has through the invention of understandings such as territory and extraterritorial control, if you take the frame being from the continental United States, utterly effaced the sovereignty and dominated the economy of the targeted nation, and as such, figuratively, this constitutes what might be rendered as super sanctions or near total economic domination. And so this is the rationale that we have with including the U.S. Virgin Islands in our process here. And to that end, we have been honored by several distinguished people from the United States Virgin Islands who will provide us with expert testimony about some of these relations and how they affect the people. But before we get to that, I would like to take a moment to introduce our jurists for today's hearing. So our jurists right now for today's hearing are the esteemed Edre Olalia and Charlotte Cates. And as well as this, Naveed and myself will be asking some questions as well in the second half And I guess I'll take this moment also to address the hearing schedule. So the first half of this hearing will be the testimony from our expert witnesses, and it will be followed by a question and answer period, which will be a dialogue between our jurists and our witnesses. Uh, So, that being said, without further ado, it is now 7:45 a.m. Pacific time. I will say, being that this is an international tribunal and we are crossing time zones, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone out there, whatever time it is in your current locale. We are very grateful that you could join us. So, yes, without further ado, I would like to welcome and introduce our first expert witness for today's hearing. And our first expert witness for today's hearing is Dr. Luanda Cummings. Dr. Luanda Cummings is a community organizational psychologist with academic work in mentoring and educational interventions, wellness and health disparities for ethnic or gender minorities, and community and workforce modeling. At the University of the Virgin Islands, she has held positions as Director of STEM Education Research, Workforce Development, Director of the Florida Caribbean Louis Stokes Regional Center for Excellence, and currently is Director of the Eastern Caribbean Center. In her new position, Dr. Cummings manages critical population research for the U.S. Virgin Islands and runs the Virgin Islands Census State Data Center. Dr. Cummings, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this morning's hearing.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I am elated to be here. I had a wonderful opportunity to meet up with Naveed at a conference in St. Croix, the Caribbean Studies Association, where we had an opportunity to share some of the work that we have been doing here at the Eastern Caribbean Center. And so I'm going to start my timer, because I know that I want to be respectful of all the other brilliance that's on the tape, that's on the call. And I'm really excited to hear from the additional experts. So I'm going to launch into some conversation around really the economic landscape that we're actually in right now, but also making sure that we put that in the context of a colonial history, or a history of colonialism based off a number of colonizers, and I guess our most recent one, the United States. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let's jump in. All right, everybody close your eyes for a second so I can pull up. There we go. I want you to see my email. All right, hi everyone. I'm really excited about getting into this particular conversation. I am was not born here. I was actually born in Atlanta, but have been in a number of battles around what it means to deal with oppression as it shows up in different ways. And my team, as the hub that actually collects data for the U.S. Census, and we do quite a bit of work with a number of governmental offices here, we have an opportunity to be able to look across offices, across questions, to see how economics, how population, demographics and things are shifting here in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So we did a presentation called Uncuffing the U.S. via Economic Landscape from the Colonial Understanding, to really start looking at a model when we look at these particular contexts. And the Eastern Caribbean Center actually has more than 50 years of experience in the data collection, research methodology, and report development space, particularly looking at population statistics here and in other spaces in the Caribbean. But we also are being very, very careful to make sure we provide a strength-focused, culturally responsive research and reporting methodology, so that we're not partaking in the deficit models that show up a lot when we start looking at the academic domain. And so I would love to be able to say this is my great work, but this is work that was done with a phenomenal team here. Presently, we have 3 PhDs there in psychology, research methods, statistics, and things like that, that really allow us to be able to think about how do we build things that are going to elucidate these particular phenomena, but also to allow us to be able to create products, data products, and procedures that would be beneficial to more than just the U.S. Virgin Islands. So I wanted to start out by really talking about our particular type of economic situation in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Here are some statistics from the 2020 census. We have 87,000 counted citizens here in the USVI, which is a 19% decrease from the last census count. And you know that has all kind of implications in regards to federal funding, in regards to support, in regards to what we have in regards to our population base for how we build. Our median income is about $40,000. Median home value is somewhere between $250,000 and $700,000. And our poverty rate is about 23%. We have 78% of our population that are high school graduates and about 22% that are here that have a BA or some other level of higher education. And this plays out for us in a lot of different ways. We have limited housing stock here after the 2017 hurricanes. And we saw that when the recovery workers came with these generous housing stipends, all of a sudden the price of rental properties escalated. And presently it's about $1,300, which is about 40% of the average monthly income here in the U.S. Virgin Islands. But there also have been hotels that have been closed for 4 or 5 years since the hurricanes, large hotel chains, which gave a rise to Verbos and Airbnbs. So places that would have rented to families are now income properties, which we're seeing all over the world, right? But even more so because there's a limit on land and space. And we have more than 50% of our local population that are renters and not homeowners. And so this escalation and kind of like constellation of things that have occurred has limited people's access and opportunity even for home ownership. We also have issues in regards to food and food imports. And I think the hurricanes really elucidated some of this because we found ourselves hit by a storm and dealing with isolation, dealing with food security issues after the disaster, and not being in a position to actually be able to address it internally, because we import about 95 to 99% of the food that we eat onto the island. Although St. Croix, and there's some other places here in St. Thomas, and I think there's one farm in St. John, although there's space for agricultural production, it is cost prohibitive. The U.S. really sends a lot of stuff here. And so then it costs money for farmers to actually produce at a rate in which they could actually sell. And so they get kind of like outsold or pushed out of those markets. And then after the hurricanes of 2017, we had a $1.5 billion loss to the territory. And that's in loss of wages to the sound of about 400 million, local government revenues, about 576 million, and then just regular commercial property damage. This is not people's houses, like just the commercial property, another 561 million. And those numbers are estimated by FEMA. And so we have these conversations regularly on island where what we're really doing is trying to fly an airplane while we build it. We're in the midst of recovery while we're also trying to prepare ourselves to participate in what every nation or locale is being asked to do, is to position ourselves to be able to get inside of this global market. And we find ourselves, struggling because there is not just the situation of where we are. There's also a colonial history. There are also these limitations in regards to market and access that are part of how we position ourselves to move powerfully into a future with some type of economic stability. So today we're going to focus on just these 4 things. Because I know I got 20 minutes. We're going to look at colonial history and the way in which we're framing this as a cuffing experience, which I think ties into some of the conversation that Jeremy just brought around sanctions. We want to talk about population shifts due to historical events because we are a blue economy and we are also in an area that has been hit by natural disasters, natural and biological. We're going to talk about migration patterns of Virgin Islanders. Presently, there are more Virgin Islanders on the mainland than actually live on the three islands. And then I want to share with you the database archetypes that we are working on right now to look at what migration and these migration patterns do to the viability of these spaces and territories. So let's talk about colonialism in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I just think it's an interesting thing because when I first moved here, I remember driving down the main street and there's a painting right by the waterfront, and it used to say America's Paradise, right? Where it was just really clear that this is a space that's owned, right? But we have to do the same thing here as we do in a lot of the work around African American or Afro-Caribbean research. We have to think about the fact that this set of circumstances that we see around us didn't start at the point of colonialism. There were original inhabitants, right, that were on this land pre-colonialism. The Taino people, they were an indigenous people and were the first ones to have contact with Europeans in 1493. And we know that these islands, the US Virgin Islands and the British Virgin Islands, were named by Columbus in honor of St. Ursula and her 11,000 martyred virgins. I'm sure that the indigenous people here did not know that they would be honoring that history as a tribe that would also be killed off. And so when we take those things into consideration in the US Virgin Islands, we have to kind of consider that there were changing faces, changing hands around the colonial experience. And when you walk down Main Street or you drive around St. Croix or any of these places, you'll see it in the names, you'll see it in the food, you'll see it in the fingerprints of colonizers all over the spaces and culture of this land. They were actually in the hands of 7 different colonizers before we were purchased by the United States. So the Netherlands, Holland, France, England, Spain, the Knights of Malta, Denmark, and then the United States. We have been part of the US for a little bit over 150 years. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time to just talk about this concept of cuffing. I have a couple young people on my team, and Beyonce has a song out about cuffing that I found out. And so this idea of cuffing is really about it relates to the concept of handcuffs, you know, being held against your will. It's about rendering a particular group or person powerless. It is also a situation when we talk about popular culture where cuffing is about a relationship of convenience. So one person, one individual may cuff up with a person during the winter because they don't want to sleep and be cold, right? So they're not really interested in the commitment. They're not really interested in the growth of the other, but they're cuffed up because of the convenience, right? And so when we think about this idea of cuffing, right, within the colonialized context, for us, we're looking at it as an economic phenomenon where we really start talking about the development of these colonized spaces for the direct production and extraction of raw materials to enrich a more powerful nation. And we have a long history of this, not just in the US Virgin Islands, but throughout the Caribbean in regards to slave labor for sugar, cotton, rum, and indigo markets. And a lot of times we think of it as some type of historical, like this couldn't be the historical concept, but truly these were some of the original Fortune 500 models for production and profit. So how do I put the least amount of resources to infrastructure so that I can reap the majority or the most benefit from it? Okay, so very exploited processes. And we also want to think about cuffing as a psychological phenomenon where there is a effort to create cultural and political dependence, excuse me. And so on the cultural side, you see the indoctrination of entire populations to ideals and values of the colonizer, right? That also has this other side of it that it denigrates the local indigenous culture or customs. So it is celebrating braids on Kim Kardashian and saying that braids are ghetto when you see it on a person of color, right? The other is in the political domain, and we see this across many islands in the Caribbean, where internal structures and capacity, or even being able to provide governance or judicial oversight, is held by a power outside of that particular context. And so any political, judicial, or economic matters have to be funneled through another power structure. And therefore, the distance even from the people that would actually be benefiting from that particular service makes it where, there's another agenda that will probably take precedence. And so when we talk about the population here in the US Virgin Islands, really it was a small group, right? It wasn't a lot of people here until we got to maybe like the 1960s and 1970s, where we had a huge influx of immigrants across the Caribbean that actually came here after we saw the boom in regards to tourism when Cuba ceased to be the space for vacations. Right? And that during that time, the US actually made this huge transition. I would say the transition around the world after World War II, where tourism became this new thing that Americans participated in. We also had medical advances that allow people to be able to come into really, prior to those medical advances, living in the Caribbean was a hostile place. Like you come, you get bit by a mosquito, you get dengue, you die. That ceased to be the set of circumstances. And we began to create the mythology of the paradise, right? And so what we see inside our population statistics here in the US Virgin Islands is that there are shifts that have occurred because of different events, right? Whether it's natural disasters, there are huge economic or industry shifts, changes occur within the population. And the biggest rise in our US in the population here was really about tourism and about manufacturing, right? So we saw in the travel embargo with Cuba, all of a sudden that space was no longer open for people to travel. And then we see this huge, really the population doubled or tripled in the 1960s and 1970s, where people were actually coming from other islands. So St. Kitts, St. Lucia, Dominica, uh, Dominica, and a couple other different places, right? All over the Caribbean, because there was work here that actually people could do within those industries. The economic boom also went into the manufacturing space and construction because all of a sudden there was a need to build hotels. There was a need for cane cutters because the sugar industry was still going on in the 1960s, but lagging, and they actually brought people in to actually boost that market. We also saw where the need for roads and streets and just infrastructure capacity for the tourism business, right, was also required. And we had lots of people who were brought in from other Caribbean islands to actually do that work. And so we see that for all of these different industries, you have this kind of inter-island migration. And the largest number really was when we were looking at the construction of the Hess Oil and Harvey Alameda industrial complexes in St. Croix. Those particular spaces uh, hired and sustained numerous families and boosted our capacity to be able to participate in these economic markets. But with every boom, right, there is also evidence of an economic decline. And we saw that with the enactment of the Jumpstart Our Business startup, like jobs, there were actually 347 companies that were closed or suspended. And this particular act actually limited in some ways people's ability in small businesses or local businesses to actually be sustained or to be counted in the same way. We saw a decrease of US visitors after all of this infrastructure had been built during the recession. That just impacted the tourism business. And that became an issue and still is an issue, right? Because the majority of our GDP is dependent upon it. There's also the closure of Provenza, and that was over in St. Croix, again, employing 2,000 employees. And was the hub of our manufacturing industry. So we lost about 50% of our capacity. And we know that Hovensa itself generated a minimum of $60 million a year in revenue for the government. And then, of course, I talked about previously, but our decrease by 18.1% of population based off of the census data just causes us to be in a position where there's a decrease in federal assistance, a smaller consumer market. So it's harder to actually attract businesses that would come and actually utilize that space, and our GDP decrease. I'm looking at my timer. Let me hurry up. Oh, Lord. All right. So the migration based off of these events really show up where we actually have people, specific people that leave. So with Hovensa, we lost skilled labor. Majority of them were males. They had either a high school diploma or a bachelor's degree. They had children, so we lose that base. And with the Irma Maria hurricanes, we lost about $11 billion. That caused 43,000 unemployment claims to be filed in the territory, and our employment to actually drop by 12%. Again, those hurricanes tore down lots of different spaces in industry around tourism that employed the majority of our people. And so who left? It was people after the hurricanes. They were not super educated. A lot of them were unmarried. 50% of them that were female, they were female and employed, but 50% of them were unemployed and actually on government assistance. But these were individuals that were working at the forefront of many of the tourism industries and sale industries here in the U.S. Virgin Islands. With COVID, it actually received $75 million for the CARES Act. That was $88 million was paid out in employment, with 70,000 stimulus checks actually mailed. But we also saw a decrease in regards to employment by almost 30% in hospitality and leisure, and in the private sector, another 13%. And who left after COVID? Again, these were not highly educated people, but a lot of them may have been living with a partner or unmarried. It was mostly males that were actually operating the transportation taxi services here, and were making on the lower end, so 26 to 28,000 a year. Those individuals actually were leaving a lot of times for better opportunities outside of the U.S. Virgin Islands, and they traveled with their children. So we didn't just lose individuals, we lost families as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that if I have time. So where did they go? Majority went to Texas. To Florida. We saw Texas, Georgia, Maryland, and New York, and Pennsylvania as the highest places based off the American Community Survey, where people were relocating. But we also are dealing with the impact of individuals moving from the mainland down to the U.S. Virgin Islands, purchasing a portion of paradise. This has been a interesting situation and conversation, because a lot of times after a disaster, people will come for the clearance sale for the land and things that are around. So a loss of land and things that have belonged to families for hundreds of years. And so I just want to say that time is up, but there are important things for us to understand. And my center is looking at this archetype. We want to know who left, right? To understand it, looking at these population specifics. So looking at brain drain, looking at the strength of people's economic capacity and workforce, the longevity, which is torso, looking at the seat of the community. So when you remove the children, you remove capacity for socializing, culture and capacity. And then the feet is really, how do we think about how we move forward? And I'm going to leave it open for anybody that has questions prior, but thank you so much, Jeremy. I am done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cummings, for that extremely informative testimony, and also for your mindfulness of the hearing schedule. We will now move to our next expert witness, and this is Senator Genevieve Whitaker. Senator Whitaker, is a human rights activist, lawyer, educator, entrepreneur, and internationally recognized speaker on political rights. recently serving as senator in the 34th legislature of the Virgin Islands. She is Chief Executive Officer of the Whitaker Consultant Group, has served as Assistant Professor of the University of the Virgin Islands, Deputy Supervisor of Elections for the election systems of the Virgin Islands, and is a 2016 Fellow for the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent, serving as a representative for the Virgin Islands in the Europe, Central Asia, and North America grouping at the forum held at the Palais des Nations at Geneva, Switzerland. It is my very great pleasure to welcome Senator Whitaker to this tribunal hearing. You may begin. Senator Whitaker, I believe you may be muted currently. It appears we may have had a little technological snafu. If people could please excuse us, we will, excuse me, we'll attempt to resolve this very quickly. Thank you for your patience. Looks like we have uh, well, as we are waiting, we'll give it just another moment as Senator Whitaker tries to reconnect in here. I'll just make take a moment to comment on the fact of that this is one of the fascinating aspects of attempting to open up international fora in this way, and that I just express gratitude at all the work that people have put in to the to facilitating the infrastructure for such international communications, and it also just highlights. This has come up in several different hearings over the course of last year, different connectivity issues and the impact that this can have on our lives and our agency in various aspects. And final note on this: gratitude to our team, and especially to Charlotte for all of the amazing work that has been done to facilitate such communications. We are still having connection difficulties. So what I'm going to do is switch the order of our witness testimony for today to try and give a little bit more space and time to resolve whatever the connectivity issues are. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Cardinal Mills. And Cardinal Mills is an attorney who began a career in the legal profession after graduating from the University of Miami School of Law in 1990. He was born and raised on the island of Nevis in the Caribbean, um, and started his working career as a primary school teacher in 1972. In 1978, he migrated to the Virgin Islands to attend what was then the College of the Virgin Islands. And after another stint of teaching at the St. Croix Central High School for 4 years, he migrated to Florida to take his legal studies. Coming back to the Virgin Islands in 2003 to continue his career. In 2014, he joined the faculty of the University of the Virgin Islands as an adjunct professor in the area of criminal justice. He's currently on contract with the judiciary of the Virgin Islands as a judicial law clerk. Uh, he was introduced in his young life to the radical and revolutionary approach to addressing the consequence of colonialism through the work of Dr. Frantz Fanon and C.L.R. James, and later through his exposure to such scholars as Dr. Eric Williams and Dr. Walter Rodney. He has since remained dedicated to understanding the impact of imperialism on people and any efforts to dismantle it. And he will be taking this background as a jumping point to discuss with us the impact of imperialism on the U.S. Virgin Islands in this context. And if I understand correctly, I believe his presentation will be dealing with the critical insular cases. So without further ado, Cardinal Mills, it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this hearing.
Thank you, Jeremy, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has been listening to this broadcast, and welcome. I did decide to take into account the insular cases because I wanted to expose what was happening with respect to the Virgin Islands in terms of the United States imperialism and address it directly. I realized earlier Jeremy was very correct when he indicated that the United States Virgin Islands is a particular case, and it does not follow the pattern of economic sanctions in the same way as other nations or sovereignties would do. Now, the insular cases are a series of opinions that were issued by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1901 concerning the status of territories acquired by the United States and the political and legal relationship between the United States and the indigenous inhabitants and residents of these territories. And the reason why I thought of addressing the insular cases is because I wanted to also bring into focus the role of the U.S. Supreme Court in preserving a formula of imperialism in the Virgin Islands and other territories. And the United States Supreme Court, you would know, is one of the most sacred, it's considered one of the most sacred institutions of the United States. Now, these cases were governed by the doctrine of unincorporation. The insular cases are actually the functional equivalent of the Dred Scott case, by which the United States Supreme Court defined the relationship between the United States and its Black population at the time. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what the Dred Scott case is about, is an enslaved man who had moved to what was called free territory and sued to get his freedom, saying that I cannot be a slave in free territory. The Supreme Court says, no, that is not possible. You are a slave, confined to that status. You cannot even bring a case in the courts of the United States because you are not a citizen. And you are not a citizen because you are not a human being. So this insular cases maintain that type of relationship between the United States and certain territories it acquired. Now, the unincorporation doctrine means that territories newly acquired by the United States were owned by the United States, but were not incorporated into the United States, and their people were not protected by its constitution. The logic of this doctrine is that the inhabitants of these territories were uncivilized savages who could not be governed by Anglo-Saxon principles. Territories that were acquired during the Spanish-American War and include Puerto Rico, Guam, Samoa, the Philippines, the Northern Mariana Islands, and then later the Virgin Islands that were acquired by sale from Denmark in 1917. In 1946, the United States relinquished its authority over the Philippines and granted statehood to Alaska and Hawaii. Now, the cases include, the first case was in 1901, Delima Bidwell, and some scholars confine the insular cases to those cases that were decided in 1901. For instance, in Downes v. Bidwell, that made the distinction between incorporated and unincorporated territories. Other authorities said that these cases went all the way up to 2022, and I will later explain why. Some of these cases, or I should say most of these cases, came out of, the early cases came out of Puerto Rico. And Puerto Ricans, as it was at that time, and up to this point, were not what you call constitutional citizens, as is the Virgin Islands. They are considered to be statutory citizens. Puerto Ricans became citizens by reason of the Jones Act and not by reason of the Constitution. In Downes v. Bidwell, that's the first case, Congress could impose tariffs on trade between Puerto Rico and the states, despite the uniformity clause, which required Congress to enforce taxes equally throughout the United States. The decision was based on the conclusion that Puerto Rico was not a part of the US for tax purposes. And there was a distinction between, incorporated territories which were in line for statehood and unincorporated territories which were not on the path to statehood. As you can tell, up to this point, Puerto Rico has still not become a state. Puerto Rico was defined as not a foreign country and not part of the United States, but not a foreign country on the one hand in Downes, and not a part of the United States in another, creating inconsistent and contradictory decisions. Now, this is consistent with a relationship of colonialism between one territory, a colonized territory, and the empire creating territory. Now, the issue relating to these territories was whether the Constitution applied to them. In 1904, the United States Supreme Court decided Doe versus the US, in which it said the people of the Philippines did not have a right to trial by jury. The Constitution did not apply to them in that respect. In Dowdell versus the United States, the people of the Philippines were considered not to have a right of confrontation, which means that they had no right to sit in court and confront the witnesses against them. The Constitution did not apply to them in that way. In 1914, in Ocampo versus the US, the people of Puerto Rico had no right to an indictment by grand jury. And in 1922, they had no right to a trial by jury. In Balzac versus Puerto Rico, they had no right to a trial by jury. So the Constitution was applicable to territories at the convenience of the United States. Now, the insular cases were consistent with the notion that shaped the nation and the hypocrisy that sustain these notions. They register America's contempt for the people of its colonies. And here are some of the contradictions. Democracy is compatible with colonialism, despite the fact that the success of colonialism required the enslavement and extermination of millions of people, while democracy is promoted on the rhetoric of comprehensive liberty through the protection of human welfare. I'm hoping that I said that slow enough so that people can absorb the contradiction in that concept. The superiority of the white race legitimizes its use of violence and brutality to establish its dominance and ensure peace and security, unless they advocate socialism or communism. Another contradiction. The superiority of the white race grants an absolute right to exclusive occupation of the earth and control over its resources. The white race has the right to assign identity and value to all other peoples of the earth. There is nothing wrong when a democracy such as the United States engages in the business of governing others as subjects who are not allowed to participate in the democratic process. As you know, people of the Virgin Islands are not permitted to vote for the president. Okay, all human beings are equal, but not all races. Some races are superior to others. The Constitution's Equal Protection Clause is not offended when people of the designated inferior races are treated differently. It is the burden of the superior race, the more civilized people, it is the white man's burden to shape the inferior people into the image and character that the white man determines to be desirable, acceptable, and approving, thereby bringing those people into civility. In Harris v. Rosario, the United States Supreme Court, in a per curiam opinion, held that less aid to Puerto Rican families with dependent children did not violate the Equal Protection Clause because in its US territories, Congress can discriminate against its citizens applying a rational basis review. And Justice Thurgood Marshall, wrote a staunch dissent against that decision, declaring that Puerto Ricans are US citizens. The fallacy of that argument in Harris versus Rosario is that it says clearly that Puerto Ricans were citizens for one convenient purpose, for the purpose of Congress's control over them, but were not citizens for purpose of the benefits of the Constitution. Stark contradiction. In Torres versus Puerto Rico, we saw a shift in the decision and made it difficult for lawyers to understand where the Supreme Court was going. In that decision, written by Justice Warren Burger, the Supreme Court overturned a decision in which Torres was convicted after a search of his luggage without a warrant while coming through the airport at in Puerto Rico from the United States. He was convicted, and even though the search was illegal, the lower courts made that decision based on the decisions made earlier by the Supreme Court that Puerto Rican citizens, the citizens of Puerto Rico, did not have access or did not have the benefit of the rights of the Constitution. Now, Justice Burger's decision reversed the conviction and says Puerto Ricans were citizens of the United States and were entitled to the protection of the Fourth Amendment. But he distinguished that Fourth Amendment provision from all other constitutional provisions. In joining the judgment, Justice Stewart, Blackmun, Marshall, Brennan, and Potter referred to a case that was decided in 1957, in which Justice Hugo Black said the concept of the Bill of Rights, and we know that the Fourth Amendment is part of the Bill of Rights, and other constitutional protections against arbitrary government are inoperative when they become inconvenient or when expediency dictates otherwise. It's a very dangerous doctrine if allowed to flourish, and would destroy the benefit of a written constitution and undermine the basis of government. So even though in 1957, Justice Hugo Black made this pronouncement, back in 1979 in Torres versus Puerto Rico, the district courts or the lower courts were still confused about how the Fourth Amendment applies to Puerto Ricans. Let's get us as far as to 2022, just last year. In a case called the United States versus Baello, the majority opinion excluded Puerto Rico from the Supplemental Superiority Income Program. Neil Gorsuch, who wrote the opinion, concurred with the majority, even though he criticized the insular cases as being shameful, having no foundation in the Constitution, as resting on racial stereotypes. Nevertheless, he agreed with the decision. The Supreme Court had the opportunity to overturn the insular cases in the case of Fitzsimonu versus the United States. But in October of 2022, the court denied certiorari because the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit had just ruled in that same case that the insular cases should stand. But the Supreme Court declined to address the issue. Now, our Congress, our delegate to Congress, Stacey Plaskett, has been consistently asking the United States Supreme Court to revisit the insular cases. I have not been checking on my time, so could somebody warn me when my time is up? I'm sorry about that. Now, these cases establish the relationship between the colonized and the colonizer. The impact of that relationship over the years are many, but the most striking impact is that is most often ignored, and that is the mental and psychological impact of colonialism or imperialism. That consequence is the most formidable barrier to the liberation of a people. It is what I consider to be the enemy within. Frantz Fanon, the renowned scholar out of Martinique, noted that oppressed people invariably internalize the culture of their oppression, resulting in various forms of mental and psychological disorder. One feature of this he called internalized inferiority. Another he identified as cognitive dissonance, in which a person finds it painful to relinquish deeply held beliefs when he or she is exposed to information which reveals the irrationality of such beliefs. And that aspect, that consequence of colonialism is very evident here in the Virgin Islands and the rest of the Caribbean. It is a barrier to fashioning curriculums that would be essential or instrumental to the intellectual development of our students here in the territory. Even at this point, there is a resistance posed by the government to having a curriculum of instruction, of information, of Caribbean and Virgin Islands history implemented in our schools, K through 12. As to citizenship, that's still up in the air. Virgin Island citizens, again, are statutory citizens, not constitutional citizens. They become citizens by virtue of the Revised Organic Act of 1954. Unfortunately, the Revised Organic Act makes provisions for the United States Bill of Rights to apply to citizens and residents of the Virgin Islands. But it's still a statute, and it still can be repealed at any time. So it's up in the air as to where Virgin Islanders are with respect to their citizenship. When we leave here and we travel to the mainland United States, if we leave here and we want to go to Florida, we have to get the approval of Border Patrol, which contradicts the idea that the United States is a part, that I should say that the Virgin Islands is a part of the United States. And that is exactly what unincorporated territory means. You're not entitled to the same rights and privileges as the people of the United States once you are in an insular territory. Investment in the Virgin Islands is not an investment in its culture or its people, but an investment in its vulnerability. Investment is merely for purposes of exploitation and not for purposes of social development. Dr. Cummings recently made reference to Martin Marietta and Hess, Hovik, Hovensa corporations, but they are not indigenous to these territories. At any moment, they could get up and leave. And that's exactly what they did, leaving the Virgin Islands in dire economic straits. As regards to self-determination, even if the Virgin Islands saw an economic opportunity, but let's say, for instance, joining CARICOM, if that were to open up economic opportunities for the Virgin Islands, that would have to be approved by the Secretary of the Interior or some other administrative agent of the United States. They couldn't decide, the Virgin Islands would not be able to decide for themselves whether or not to join an organization, a regional organization with the people who share the same history, the same culture, and the same desire for development. So even
Professor
though,
Mills, I'd just like to interject. You have 2 minutes left, sir. Thank you.
okay, even though one of the outstanding features of our Constitution of the United States is self-determination, that is considered to be one of the inalienable rights that the Constitution enumerates. So at this point, the Virgin Islands are not sanctioned economically as a sovereign nation, but it's sanctioned economically by being under the control of a colonial power. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Professor Cardinal Mills. It is now my very great pleasure to welcome Senator Genevieve Whitaker as our final expert witness for today's hearing. I won't repeat the full bio, but I will just, for those who did not catch it the first time, Senator Whitaker is a human rights activist, lawyer, educator, entrepreneur, internationally recognized speaker on political rights, and has recently served as senator in the 34th legislature of the Virgin Islands. Again, welcome to the hearing. Please proceed.
Thank you, and greetings to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. I just want to really thank the People's Tribunal for this opportunity, and it's a pleasure to be here today. And also to greetings to my fellow witnesses. And so I would like to begin just by expressing the fact that we have a lot of things have occurred over time but we have really a ways to go in terms of addressing the issues regarding our right to self-determination, on the matter of even the matter of decolonization. And yes, I am a former senator. I served in the 34th legislature, and it's even relevant to this topic. During my time in the 34th legislature, I served as the liaison to the Department of Interior Office of Insular Affairs, which I'll dive into for the presentation. When I returned home, I dove right into the reparations movement, serving as the council secretary, and in 2009, I co-founded the Millennials. We co-founded the Virgin Islands Advocacy Coalition. In 2016, I was selected and took part as a fellow for the International Decade of People of African Descent. Following year, as part of the competitive process, took pride and was selected to represent the Virgin Islands for that time, which was the second meeting of the International Decade of People of African Descent through the decade period of regional meetings. We were part of the North America, Europe, Central America. Then in 2020, I submitted, which is the first ever report through what's going to this presentation, what's known as the Universal Periodic Review Process, which was submitted in 2020. And as the previous witness, Attorney Mills pointed out, the full history of the legal framework of our treatment within the jurisprudence, I've titled really this racist jurisprudence that has come out of the Supreme Court over a number of years. That in the 34th legislature, I was able to pass Resolution 1899, joining with the territory of Guam in really calling for the returning of the insular cases. I would like to turn and then really talk, because a lot of my presentation is focusing on the international advocacy and even this framework on the international stage. We have a very, very old resolution. We also have the UN Charter itself. I'll highlight the resolution that was passed back in 1960 by the UN General Assembly, which affirmed the ensuring decolonization. Dr. Carla Corben, who is a mentor, he served over 5 administrators, Virgin Islands governors, and is an expert called upon, the expert with the United Nations. And he summarized it 4 years later in his presentations that the people of the territories, really expounding upon the notion that and our right to human rights is that we should have equal status, and we are guaranteed these fundamental rights and freedoms without any discrimination. That's a positive. We should have equal rights and opportunities for representation, and it should be effective at all levels: executive, legislative, and judicial. We are now, some of you may not be aware, but we are now in the fourth decade for the eradication of colonialism. This period starting in 2021, going to 2030. And again, the General Assembly declaring the need to, in this resolution, call for an intensification, plan of actions, cooperative efforts, just by information every year. The territories have an opportunity to present before, to be part of the committee process through the full committee, where you can present on matters surrounding our political, social, economic issues. And then during the opening session, it was again reiterated that it should be a strive for decolonization. And I say these are just, many ways there's a lot of bureaucracy because, of course, if we're in this fourth decade, what meaningful efforts have been made. I will share with all of you one of the challenges we have as we're in the Virgin Islands is that we have departed. We have departed away from essentially participating in these processes. So in many ways, the last time that our government attended, as a governmental, it's quite a number of years. Really and truly, our current Lieutenant Governor, Jordan Roach, being the most participatory level government official in terms of these types of things. And one of the things that Dr. Cummins highlighted, which she talked about migration and migration patterns and the impact of storms. One of the things that you will find, and I throw this in here because to lay out some of the modern day, some of the challenges we face is that we are, because of our vulnerable status, because we continue to be discriminated against, because really the right to self-expression is not going to be realized for Virgin Islanders. There's some definitions. We'll talk about that disaster capitalism, which I've had to experience and face firsthand in my capacity as a senator, having to actually address a number of issues in that era where a lot of money has been and continues to go to territory. We're conscious and avoided persons, in many cases, take advantage of us. These are some of the definitions. We had in Britannica, one of the entries, Klein defined disaster capitalism is a form of extreme capitalism that advocates privatization and deregulation in the wake of war or natural catastrophe. It's going to point to the shock doctrine that was adopted in a feature-length documentary by director Michael Winterbaum in 2009. We had a young, one of the Teen Vote, which is related to the local section, Jackie German, in her article on what is disaster capitalism, cycle of crisis, exploitation, and privatization, really exploring how this vulnerability, how it leads to privatized exploitation. And at the top, really the concept of disaster capitalism, taking advantage of major disaster to adopt neoliberal economic policies that populations would be less likely to accept under normal circumstances.
Sorry, Senator Whitaker, your audio is a bit muffled. Is there a way to I think folks are having a difficult time hearing.
Oh, yeah, okay, I didn't.
And then on your screen sharing, I think for me, it's just showing your first slide still. I'm not sure if you had been moving slides.
Yeah, I was moving a slide.
Oh, okay.
One second. Quick, give me 1 minute. Is that better?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. So on to federal relations and our federal relationship. One of the things Navid, are you guys seeing the current slide, dehumanization?
Yes, dehumanization of Virgin Islanders, yes.
And so in the context, hello?
Hi,
Yeah.
the issue is that you're sharing the actual, you're sharing, you're not sharing the slideshow, you're sharing your PowerPoint program. So that's where you'll have to change the slides for us to see them.
Okay. Okay, I'll do that for now because I. So we have the dehumanization of Virgin Islanders in the context that under the U.S. Congress, U.S. House of Representatives Committee, known as we're under the Natural Resources Committee, which has jurisdictions over the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and the Virgin Islands, as well as the Commonwealth of the Marianas, and all the Confederated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau under the Compact of Free Association. Arguably, a lot of efforts, as we talk about priorities, is really centered on a lot of times on Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, American Samoa. And these are the jurisdiction areas: water, oceans, energy, minerals, the indigenous people of the U.S. and oversight investigations. And one of the things that I highlighted through my advocacy efforts is that even the representation of being represented with the symbol of a bull of bison that was that represents even a specific community. Right now, the committee's logo, which I'll share in a moment, of course, showing waterways and like, and then even how they present the information in terms of the fact sheets. We have a situation. We have in terms of the fact sheets. You will see that essentially there's no mention, right? So we have the fact sheet here. Why should I break the situation? Listing all of the territories that they have oversight over. And then right here, if you look economic challenges, it says all the territories, most notably Puerto Rico, face serious economic challenges and very high debt load because Congress has failed to replace outdated incentives that weren't necessary for economic growth. Kind of in some ways also to cherry picking and saying, well, in most notably, but this is the reality we face too as Virgin Islanders. Many ways, a lot of times we have a situation where we're essentially, when it comes to doling out funds and so on, we're like second bids, or sometimes we don't get any. Even most recently, for example, a situation some of our partners brought to my attention, local farmers, where by the time we got to them, there were concerns that they were back most of the funding. And these are the priorities as chair, Representative Parrott Hagman. These are the main priorities of the subcommittee on Indian and Southern Affairs. These are the main items: lower energy costs, safeguard, as well as the Indo-Pacific task force. The jurisdiction of the subcommittee. The subcommittee's jurisdiction, as you will also note here, that these are the areas that they have jurisdiction over, but if you'll notice in terms of the membership, there's actually a council class, for example, is not a member. Of course, that also depends on how, of course, the committee process where persons are appointed to various committees and subcommittees, but we're definitely represented there. Are you all seeing the slide and jurisdiction of the subcommittee?
No, I was actually just going to interject.
So-
The slide has not
It
changed.
hasn't
We
shifted,
have,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. So you see it now? Yeah. You see it now,
Yes, thank
correct?
you.
Yes. Moving on now to the tools of advocacy. These are the tools that, in many ways, there's a lot of work to do, especially here in the Virgin Islands, with understanding the tools and using them. We have challenges around, for of course, our lack of participation in the United Nations processes, as Trini Mills pointed out. We have, to get approval, particularly for CARICOM, we have to get approval to the U.S. Department of State, and it all depends on who's governor. Really, that governor is advocating on our behalf. So one of the tools that we have is doing presentations on the international stage. In 2007, and this is something as we provide to the jurists, that some of the compilations of information. But when you're, I particularly focused my presentation at that time, and this was actually during my fellowship period, we had an opportunity to actually take part in a live presentation. At that time, the meeting of all the civil society, people of African descent. And I touched on our political right issues, culture rights, and development, economic development. You only have 3 minutes to present, and they're very strict about time. And so, when I presented on the matter of our political rights, I pointed out as an example when we were in the process of crafting our fifth constitution, and the fifth constitution convention process, and they needed funds of $200,000 to finalize some of the concerns that were raised by the U.S. Congress, because unlike actually Puerto Rico, we have a much longer process. It requires the entire majority vote of the U.S. House of Representatives in order to move and approve our constitution. It's quite whereas they go through a much easier process. They don't have the requirement to go to that huge body. We were denied $200,000, but turn around the time of our centennial, we essentially, we were provided $500,000 to celebrate our centennial of colonial our status. And some of these are just examples. In terms of our cultural rights, we have essentially one of the things that I've been very much part of the issue of addressing the teaching of Virgin Islands Caribbean history in Virgin Islands schools. We would have essentially some of the publications. Of course, it's the government that the officials and the persons that put together the materials. And while this this forum is not focused a lot on, because Oaxaca should dive into the mental slavery aspect, the aspect of persons really not understanding who they are and put in these positions, whereby compilations of informations and materials by publishing companies that promote systemic racism, promote that among our people. And as you speak right now, a lot of our textbooks and workbooks, unfortunately, there's an effort up front. There's definitely an effort by the Department of Education to teach Virgin Islands Caribbean history, but we are ways away because we're still dealing with materials that are of a discriminatory nature. And our economic development, the matter of economic development in terms of our means of integration, as I spoke before about CARICOM, is that we also have a 6% customs duty that in the Danish times was also levied against the Danish West Indian peoples. The next item is, as I spoke of in the beginning, one of the tools is the universal periodic review process. And every 4.5 years, the Universal Periodic Review process provides the member state the opportunity to go through a peer review of their human rights records. The purpose of this is to obtain reports, actions, to receive a number of situations of concerns, also to receive recommendations. And one of the things that was unfortunate was that because of the pandemic for the 2020, that was the last year for the United States, was that essentially because of COVID, there was an effort. I was putting together delegation, but ultimately didn't have a virtual delegation. But I did my organization, Virtual Advocacy Coaching through the organization. I was part of the U.S. Human Rights Network, and national organization, but related to the matter of human rights and advocacy. I was able to be part of their process to educate. I was part of their webinar series process and preparing for the actual meeting where I got to, and I also assisted persons within the Caribbean on the process, how to prepare the report and so on. And I along with others, I led that effort, put together the actual report for the nationalities. And the next, should be noted, the next time that the United States will be before will be in the 50th session, and that's a period, those are different various states as it pertains to the process. And the goal is to put together a delegation to prepare personalities to participate in that process. One of slide. This is the cover sheet of the submission, as well as the executive summary of the submission, and what the UPR procedure provides. The tool provides is an opportunity to examine everything from resolutions to treaties to laws. Everything you're able to essentially put together, but also telling a story. And so the story that I essentially told, really highlighting a number of key areas. One area was the public awareness of colonial status, right? The fact that there's no actual curriculum on decolonization. You pretty tough to find. There are various information, but it's not actual real curriculum. There's only been one documented effort to address the matter of our status, which occurred back in 1993, and it was and never to really be seen again, that level of effort. And even I highlight even going back to the matter of disaster capitalism and the positions, the vulnerability that we face, is that we had the HUD secretary, then HUD secretary in 2017, Ben Carson, posited that he stated that recovery efforts in jurisdictions prepared to do their part should not be held back due to alleged corruption, fiscal irregularities, and fiscal management occurring in Puerto Rico, and capacity issues in the Virgin Islands. So while he posited that it should not be held back because of it, mismanagement and the like, what we've faced now through the process is essentially the fact that because of historic irregularities and fiscal mismanagement, and even in the case where there was a situation in Puerto Rico where a person went to jail and like over disaster funding, our efforts to then rebuild our schools and our facilities is not a very protracted process, which really which in many cases is a structure that we do it through a reimbursement process. We've had, in terms of the Department of Interior, the same Department of Interior that denied us $200,000 to finish our Constitution, or gave us $500,000 to celebrate our centennial status, is also the same that has given the University of the Virgin Islands a few times now funding. One instance, $250,000, which they, led by Dr. Saku, put together a compilation, a book of our history in terms of our political status and the like. But a true, actual decolonization education effort really has been done most majority by organizations, not and various NGOs here in the Virgin Islands, to include my organization and others. Other organizations, both in mind, of course, a newer, younger organization, and our historic NGOs and organizations that date over many decades here in the Virgin Islands that were largely for which VIAC stands on the shoulders of. And even to that can be a whole entire, as we teach decolonization, bringing awareness of historic actions for decolonization. Also in the report, highlighting the stories, the actual stories of Virgin Islanders, things that we have faced, and showing the document and stories of examples of violations. Various stories. We have efforts for us to address our right to vote. Of course, largely, of course, denied, cannot vote for the U.S. president. We had both in the Donald Trump administration 2018 and Barack Obama administration 2016, pushing up again, filing cases filed. This is a litigation occurring around the right to vote, and also addressing insert cases that both administrations and continue to today, to the Biden administration, no change in any efforts to turn over these cases, and rather no efforts to, we'll take efforts on the government and
Senator
I'll just scroll down
Whitaker,
for time's sake.
yeah, I was just going to give a time check,
now?
Senator Whitaker, for 2 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's perfect. And part of the report are actually actual recommendations. So as you close out your report, really providing recommendations, to what all of, connected to all the things, information that you provided in the report. These are some of the recommendations. The U.S. really began the process of working with the original government for a deliberate plan of action to decolonize. One of the things through the committee process, the UN Committee on Decolonization, has been the U.S.'s commitment to, in the case of our status, enhanced status, and there's been no changes. There's been no quote unquote, increase enhancements. Recommending that the U.S. put an end to the unfair healthcare practices. For example, Social Security 2 is not available to Virgin Islanders who have to live in the contiguous state or in the states to be afforded that right. Just a small example. There are a number of others. Because even when it came to Obamacare, while the states had the opportunity to choose between Medicaid or a health system, we had to just we had to make a choice, one or the other. Most recently, some change, but thankfully, though, I do understand that that has changed. There's some changes up front whereby we'll be able to have a system whereby, especially the middle class, are able to get insurance. And these are the other areas of task force to address reestablished a referendum process. Unlike Puerto Rico, we've only really had one referendum process. Puerto Rico has had a number of those processes. And also too, this report was done in collaboration with one of the organizations, the Virgin Islands Sacramento Council. There was situations in the Rastafarian community, for which I assisted. I helped them start the organization and advocate for their rights. And I would like to, in conclusion, express that this effort, this hearing and other efforts, one of the things that we really have to do and continue to do is to empower ourselves to advocate, as I shared during during the process of taking part as a presenter for the Caribbean Student Studies Association Conference, that these are there are various calls for actions, decolonizing, just really and truly on front of our governor, which I continue to advocate. It's sometimes come a little bit. It is frustrating to see how much time we're gonna ask the person responsible for moving us forward in that area. Development of key partnerships. I have historically worked with other groups, include, for example, Puerto Rico. I took part in this kind of event, and let's just continue. So let's continue to be fight for justice. And thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for the insightful and significant testimony. And again, thank you to all of our expert witnesses. This has been a powerful hearing so far. Now we will be transitioning into the second half of the hearing, and this is our question and answer period, where jurists will be able to ask our witnesses questions regarding the testimony. This will be facilitated. I will pass the baton to my colleague, Professor Navid Farnia, but I will remain here in the hearing and potentially have a question or two of my own for our witnesses, time permitting. So again, thank you to everyone, and Navid, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, and special thank you to all of our witnesses for their excellent and insightful testimonies. A lot of really important information, I think, was presented in this session. So again, really appreciate it. I'm going to start by introducing our lead juror for today, who is Attorney Edre Olalia, who's coming to us from the Philippines. Unfortunately, he can't speak himself. It's late at night there, and he has family sleeping. But he did provide me questions in the chat that I'm going to read out. He also made a comment in relation to Attorney Cardinal Mills' earlier presentation. And Attorney Olalia said the following: the fallacious contradictions justified by the legal fictions in the cited U.S. Supreme Court insular decisions prove once again that law is in the end what the justices say, and what the justices say usually reflect the bias of the ruling or dominant class in society. These decisions, quote unquote, legitimize colonialism and discrimination and multiple standards, which continues to this day and serve imperialist designs. And then he followed up by posing the following questions. The first question he asked is, how do Virgin Islanders generally react or respond to this discrimination and second-class citizen treatment? Is it acceptance, acquiescence, indifference, or resistance? And then his second question is, are there people-to-people collective responses from other nations similarly situated to resist or change these common unjust treatments? So for any of the witnesses, if you want to answer the first or second question, the floor is yours.
Let me try to attempt to answer that first question. How do Virgin Islanders respond? And let me apologize. On Friday I updated my camera drivers, so I'm kind of amazed as to why I'm not getting it to respond at this time. So I apologize for the lack
Oh,
of
no,
video
no worries at all. No worries at all.
on my part. The response in the Virgin Islands is varied, and you would expect to see the same kind of responses in any formerly colonized territory. There is going to be some resistance. There is going to be some acquiescence. There's going to be some complicity. As I indicated in the early part of my presentation, Dr. Franz Fanon identified that people who have been subjected to a system of oppression usually are invariably internalize that oppression and identify with it. There are people in the Virgin Islands who are passionate about being identified as living in the United States or being US citizens. They would hear none of it if you said to them, look, in the Virgin Islands, people are identified, the people of the Virgin Islands are identified as statutory citizens by reason of their relationship to the United States. That statute is what is called the Revised Organic Act, 1954. The Virgin Islands was acquired by the United States in 1970. It took all that time for it to provide a statute that says that recognized Virgin Islands as citizens. But what type of citizen? The Constitution of the United States says that people who are born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. Virgin Islanders, I should say the Virgin Island is not the United States. And there are people who would refuse to accept that. It is a piece of property that the United States owns, and it treats it as such property that we own, and it treats the people as such property that we own. So you would find that the responses would be in all of those areas that the question identified: acquiescence, resistance, condemnation. All of the different responses would apply.
And, and I,
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Senator Whitaker.
and my focus is a lot on the education and the miseducation. It's really endemic. We have okay, I mean, I do respect like at a collegiate level, there's a lot of for like University of Virgin Islands, there's a lot of efforts to teach Caribbean history, Virgin Islands history. It's at the collegiate level, and even if you look at when we look at our colleges in general, universities. There's a lot of, you can actually improve your PhD in decolonization and in the social sciences areas. But the preparation there is very, I mean, on average, we don't have, because we don't have decolonization curriculum, this is practically non-existent in the Virgin Islands. That really and truly, but for certain actions, and I'm really proud to be part of, individuals who helped some of the person in my generation realize the importance of it, and they particularly went to school in that, and then the master's and PhDs in decolonization. They supported them. That the whole point is that until we have, to me, and this goes even to the US's how, in fact, the fact that the US has failed to really fully realize the very few human rights treaties that it's ratified. For example, when we talk about this outright discrimination, we have the federal government obviously giving funding to the Virgin Islands and other, just running up the states, and their workbooks and textbooks throughout the United States are not, continue to either just have, speak about it at all, or misinterpret, or, and as a child, having lived at times in my childhood in the States, I remember not forgetting in fourth grade having to bring my placemat to my fourth grade class in Maryland, expressing my teachers that I do exist, that even though your map doesn't show my islands, that I do exist. This is where I'm from St. Croix. I come here now, and and I want to be seen. And so events of that, the curriculum itself, and then just as I dovetail, the whole concept of us being, the whole concept around our federal relations, what really are there? We as we are right now in a situation post Irma Maria where there's going to be one new school built in the next couple of years, a total of 8 to 10 years. We'll build to rebuild all of our schools. And back in the late 70s and early 80s, we were building multiple schools in a much shorter period that are still standing and they need to be rebuilt. So what kind of country do we belong to where our federal relations have it so that when we have storms and buildings are damaged, schools are damaged, they give us a whole bureaucratic process to get our situation in control and then the same system that is not really supporting any efforts for us to be colonists within the curriculum. There's no actual real funding for organizations to really push on and to get into the schools and have funding to teach decolonization. It's very effective. So I would say curriculum, education, and then really strained and poor federal relationship.
Well, no, I would just say that I remember when I was a faculty member at UVI, and we had a visitor from Justice Sonia Sotomayor that came down and did a presentation, and there were questions that the students actually prepared, had to be vetted, that whole process. And one of the things that the students asked about was about the possibility, the potentiality of the U.S. Virgin Islands being able to have some self-determination. So there is conversation, and there are people that are inside that movement, right? But one of the things that she said that I thought was really profound, she said it very nicely, is she walked around and she was like, what military do you have? What capacity do you have to make the United States give you the self-determination, the capacity to be able to operate in any way as an independent agent? And I think that that's the thing, is that Mills, as well as Senator Whitaker, really touched on the fact that we're not just in a battle around the distribution of power or capacity or self-determination. We're in this kind of, again, that cuffing relationship, this kind of weird stepchild situation where codependence and maybe overdependence has been facilitated. And so I think that there are people that are inside the conversations that are not going to be a part of the open narrative around how do they build out capacity, how do they build out possibilities, how do they build out structures of power for themselves. But again, we're that brown kid that got painted over. Y'all recently saw that? Like, they had this whole painting that came out, and then when they cleaned it, they found out there was a little chocolate child on there. Like, I feel sometimes like we're in the painting, but someone painted trees in front of us. And so there's some literature by Nobles and by Asa Hillier inside the education domain, inside the political domain, where we have to figure out how do we cease to look at these systems as being built to facilitate us. And Audre Lorde said, they're never going to give you the tools to dismantle their house. That's just not how it's built. And so I think that there's some conversations about the shadow cabinet, like how do we protect the cultural legacy, the understanding around this particular context, so that we are the purveyors of what makes us strong and what makes us capable. But the systems that we see that are not working are working the way that they intend to work, right? Which is to strip people of legacy and knowledge of their own strength and capacity, and to create a hugely dependent relationship. So that, my dad used to say to us, because he used to pick cotton when he was a kid, he said, the scary thing is we are lacking in so much in regards to knowledge around what it took to survive, that quite honestly, if they close down all of the major grocery stores, can they put you back in the fields? Can they put you in a place of such dependence because you don't have the skills or capacities to be able, or the legacy knowledge to be able to build your own? What can we do? So it just feels like they've created a different kind of dependence, right? But she said explicitly, where is your military? Where are your armies? As if to say, it will not be given. And I don't know if you're strong enough to take it.
Thank you so much to all of you. I also want to
And I want
follow
to
up.
just,
Go ahead, go ahead.
I just want to one follow-up point, which is kind of brought out by Dr. Cummings, is that when I was in Geneva for my fellowship, that that in fact one of the chairpersons, one of the heads, she's one of the experts. She basically said to me that I'm wasting my time. Basically, this is a person who was responsible for investigating issues of human rights concerns for people of African descent. And she posited, like, because that's also too. There's also, because of our, like I said, extreme relationship, even somebody who has a background of human rights, their responsibility to investigate. I was flat out told that this issue of the territories and so on, that sort of my assertions of our colonial status, I'm sort of kind of wasting my time. And I never could forget that. So that's also been a motivating factor. One of the things that we do need is actual training. One of the attendees did comment about Blockades, I'm showing as an example, and that's really true. True community organizing around us, and the willingness for persons to get together and be trained. That's a lot of times, experts and you may expert whatever area, but there's a notion of there's a need for training, and there's a willingness that has to come with that desire to be trained and to be prepared to advocate.
It is interesting that the military would be looked upon as essential to a people's independence and self-determination. But our people have never been looking in that direction. Our people have always emphasized that our power lies in our communion. That's what Marcus Garvey said. That's what the H. Sylvester Williams said, C.L.R. James. The military exercise, as we've seen them, it probably becomes necessary. The military exercise only becomes necessary if there is somebody who's willing to stand in the way of our quest for self-determination and would not give way to it except through the loss of blood, as evidenced by the Haitian Revolution. They had no interest in war, as evidenced by the Cuban Revolution. They had no interest in war. The thing is that when Haiti was offered the alternative to pay reparations to France or face the possibility of war, they said, look, we are trying to build our nation here. We'll pay the reparation. And those factors, the fact of having to pay reparations has kept Haiti in a state of instability. And it was still invaded by the United States in 1950. So and there's one other name I should call right out of St. Thomas. The name does not come to me just yet, and it should really come to me automatically. I'm hoping that Genevieve would remind me, who was one of the early 20th century Pan-Africanists. He advocated the communion of our people as the essence of our power. The labor movement, and one of the most powerful labor movements, came right out of St. Croix, emphasized the communion of our people in the quest for our self-determination. So the military.
You talk about Wilmot Blyden? You talk about Blyden?
Edward Wilmot Blyden, that's the name. Okay, so it has never been our decision to create war on anybody. A military was the furthest from our mind. We were never interested in war. We were always interested in building. as our leaders have demonstrated over the years. So I still don't think I see the logic behind the reference to the military, unless she's saying the United States would never allow you self-determination without a war.
And Mills, that's what I took from it. I can't say I don't presume to assume what she meant by it, right?
Yeah.
But when the question was presented, that's the option. She didn't say you guys can organize. She didn't say you could get more education. She didn't say you could build. She said, well, do you have a military?
Yes. And that's one of the possibilities I would take from it, you know. So
Thank you all. At this point, I want to ask if Jeremy has any questions for our witnesses.
Yes, I do. Thank you. This has been a fascinating dialogue. I think a question that comes up for me, and it's perfect to kind of piggybacking on this recent discussion of forms of attaining or not forms but processes for attaining self-determination or sovereignty in various aspects. I'm struck by a couple things. One, something that's come up in all of the presentations, all of the testimony, and this is the question regarding the structural blocking of the Virgin Islands in affiliating or associating itself with potential allied international bodies such as CARICOM has come up a couple times. Another that comes to mind is that was not raised, but is the New Development Bank. As here we are, just post BRICS summit, right? And what's striking to me about this is the unfortunate political liminality of these nations in this territorial, in this legacy territorial relationship, specifically when we think of the economic aspect, and this is kind of getting to my question here. It's striking to me. Dr. Cummings brought up, for example, a $1.5 billion loss due to a natural disaster, and yet $1.5 billion for a nation with the economy the size of the United States of America is nothing. Let alone what it could be, if we were sourcing it from the international community writ large. And so it is a definite aspect of oppression that the Virgin Islands is at once refused the aspect of sovereignty, of really truly directing the economic development of the territory, and at the same time refused access to what seems like obvious sources of economic and financial support. And I wonder what then I mean, in the context, in the last couple of years, as a counterpoint, over $76 billion has been given to the war in Ukraine. Right, and here we're talking about 200,000 here or $1.5 billion here that somehow cannot be provided. So I guess in piggybacking off that last conversation, if we're not talking about a military confrontation, which of course seems a little bit otherworldly right now, as a liberation scheme for the Virgin Islands, what would economic sovereignty look like in practical terms, maybe even in numbers, right? Moving forward in terms of investment in a growing self-determined economy, in terms of providing necessary infrastructure, etc., and what are maybe possible ideas about revenue streams while the battle continues for fair or just treatment from the United States.
I want to say, Jeremy, that we have been able to secure over $1.7 billion in disaster recovery aid that's administered by our Housing Finance Authority. But as it is, we have the whole concept of mental enslavement has resulted in us giving those funds largely to outsiders, as well as making it difficult for Virgin Islanders to access those funds. So what it would first result in is, and we can't change the minds of adults necessarily, the only much we can do with adults. It's going to be so imperative, and that's why I'm so focused on education, because we have to build up the leaders who will become those individuals who will lead our nation, will be appointed, elected individuals who will have the mindset to make better decisions with the use of our funds. Also, too, this concept of the 6% duty tax, all these different things that we adopted, carried it forward from the Danish era, putting a stop to it, analyzing, what benefit we really gain from that. And those are my comments. It's so we have access to capital, but because of colonialism, because of what it does to the mindset, how it hinders people, and we couple it with a miseducation, and then we also have that throughout the whole United States, because we have individuals who become members of Congress and so on that make decisions for us as Virgin Islanders who too do not understand colonialism, and so they too participate in the discriminatory framework of what we face. So there's a lot of re-education, miseducation, we have a lot of hearts and minds to shift in order for us to even achieve political economic. In this case, economic is going to really require a whole shift of mindset.
If I were to look at that question, I would begin by answering by looking at our origin. If Sanctions alone was able to provide wealth to 7 different nations that occupied this territory over the period of its existence under colonialism, and it provided wealth for countries, for the aristocracy of these countries, based on its agricultural framework. But yet still, we cannot get an agricultural program off the ground in St. Croix that would lend itself to the sustainability of the people in St. Croix. That, to me, looks like a contradiction. So what we have is an attempt to I should say, replace that with something called investment. And as I've said earlier, investment in the Virgin Islands, it's not an investment in its culture or its people but it's an investment in its vulnerability. In
Mhm.
the early 1970s, I should say in the 60s, we saw investments in the hospitality industry.
Mhm.
Okay, Cuba had lost its tourism. The tourists were directed particularly to St. Thomas. Usually, after that, St. Croix got into the tourist attraction business. But then we had an incident here in 1972, which we call today as the Fountain Valley incident. That stagnated St. Croix in terms of the development of its tourist industry. Yet, hurricanes are another, I should say, hurricanes in particular are another factor that undermines the tourist industry and the rebuilding of these facilities after they are destroyed by hurricane. But if I am thinking, if these were indigenous institutions, you know, you used to have a few hotels here, the Grapetree Bay Hotel, the Grapetree Beach Hotel, which is now called Divi, Carina Bay. You know, the shops, Little Switzerland, Sparky, those little shops in town that provided things. There was Woolworth, and finally, towards the end of this century, there was Kmart. And for a while, St. Croix, the Virgin Islands, was the only place among the United States and in territories that sustained the viability of Kmart up until recently. It has closed its store in St. Croix. Beyond that, we look at the Hess, Hovick, Hovensa investments. Okay, those are all corporations that occupy the refinery. Each time they can just change the economics. They came in as investors, but each time they had the power to change the economic circumstances of St. Croix at a moment's notice. And they would just pick up and leave or suspend some of their activities and put many of the people who depended on them for a livelihood back on the street. Many of them left the island in droves, sometimes leaving valuable property behind. Many people who had built businesses around the activity at Martin Marietta or Hess, Hovick, Hovensa, whichever you want to call it, they see a loss in their revenues as people leave. The local businesses that depended on the population, economics depend on a population. The local businesses that depended on that population would fall into decline and eventually become extinct. That is what continues to happen over and over again in the Virgin Islands. Now, as far as the tourist industry is concerned, it's a little bit more stable in St. Thomas than it is in St. Croix. And so we have this up and down in the Virgin Islands as a whole, and people become frustrated and they feel that they can have a better chance, more stability if they leave the Virgin Islands and move on to the continental United States, thereby leaving a large economic void to be filled by we don't know from where.
I would just like to add, if I could, that part of the projections when we talk about economic stability is these concepts around workforce, right? And one of the things we found in our migration archetype was that at different times, what we were losing were the best and the brightest, right? People with degrees. When Hovensa closed, we lost a lot of people with specific training. And so they went to the mainland or to other opportunities. And for the families that are leaving, or even for UVI, right? We're always trying to recruit students here. They let you go to school for free. Like, we're doing everything we can to have students to attend the only HBCU outside of the continental United States. But the issue is that if I have a student that is really bright, that's really done well in high school, the aspiration is for them to go to school off island. And I'm not here to poo-poo that, but those students are not necessarily returning to the workforce in the territory. And so a lot of the specialized skills that we see here, I would say even I'm an import, right, are imported into the US Virgin Islands for the work to be done. But we have a lack of consistency around being able to maintain that specialization because other opportunities will show up and people go somewhere else because they can make more money or they can have a Walmart, whatever the reasons are. But that lack of stability in regards to a sustained and developing workforce is problematic, because that's where the entrepreneurial businesses in domains outside of tourism would actually emerge. The university now is doing a lot of work around trying to do training in data science and AI, machine learning, building out infrastructure and getting grants and stuff like that to try to create space so that it may be inside the domains and the economies that can be built around technology, that there could be some capacity to build a space where you can have workforce where people can stay and not necessarily have to relocate to another place because the opportunities are somewhere else. So that workforce focus has to be a part of this conversation, but we also got to think about how do we diversify our GDP. The GDP right now is based off of how many people can go in and provide service to people treating this like it's the paradise of America. And that's problematic because then there's not a place for my really, really strong students to work. One of the things that used to upset me is we would have a conference or something, and I would go and I would see my students who were phenomenal at statistics or research methods. And because they were very articulate, they would put them at the front desk of a hotel. That's, you understand what I'm saying? So like, this is where we have placed you in regards to what you can build for the future for this space. So I think we have to think differently about which industries need to be invested in. There's some opportunities now that did not exist before, and figure out how we can build strength in those areas. But Ms. Cardinal, I agree with you, because after the hurricanes, when it was just like there wasn't a grocery store or there was a guard standing outside a grocery store with a gun, but we got farmland everywhere, and there's not a infrastructure, a system, even between the islands for us to utilize those resources in an effective manner. Like, we have to rethink what it means to be a part of the United States, but not really be a part of the United States, so that we have some systems and structures of support internally to circulate our own sustenance. Do you understand what I'm saying? So
Exactly.
yeah.
I just want to quickly add on the matter of farmers. I gave a real example because I gave all of our farms to the Virgin Islands, and something as simple as getting fence through the U.S. Department of Agriculture is very tenuous. And some of the farmers that I'm engaged with are generational farmers with land, and they're very good at what they do. And so even to that, the bureaucracy of just obtaining basic resources to be an effective farmer, whereby, and then like I gave during my presentation, the fact that, okay, we're going to give money to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, but we're going to give most of the money to Puerto Rico, and whatever we have left, if we have any left, we'll give to you guys, you farmers. And that happened most recently. So that's what we have as well. It's straight up, just acts of discrimination and ways of debilitating the people. Very basic. How hard would it be to give them funds or to provide fencing? How hard is that? But they will come out. I've heard stories of persons from the federal government coming out to their lands, and say, oh, and we notice that area is closed now, what can we do? And it's sort of just, it's pretty messed up.
One more thing I'd like to add is that the Virgin Islands right now is going through an extremely precarious health crisis. People getting adequate medical services, either from a local clinic or the hospital. People have to be airlifted off the islands for maybe sometimes services that should be able to be provided right here. And one of the things that I also look at is mental health service. There isn't a facility that deals with that. There aren't any resources to build such a facility and to attract the expertise that is necessary to sustaining such a facility. So a lot of our mental health patients end up in the prison system. They're sitting in jail, and the prison officers are scheduling their medication. Now, what are they doing in a prison in the first place when they really should be in a mental health facility? And it's all because somebody's going to say the funding is not there to build such a facility and to sustain it. That, again, is one of the real serious consequences of colonialism, of imperialism, of the United States deciding that the people of the Virgin Islands are not smart enough to determine for themselves what it is that is best for them. It got to stop someplace, or else we are heading to some form of annihilation.
Thank you. So I want to wrap up with one final question. We're approaching 2.5 hours, so I want to be as quick with this as possible. But it is the follow-up, the second question that Attorney Alalia presented earlier, which I think is a very important question. So I want to end on it. And so he asked, and I don't think anybody directly addressed this, so I want to ask it again. But he asked, are there people-to-people collective responses from other nations similarly situated to resist or change this unjust treatment? So, for example, are there collaborations? Are there sort of collective responses from people from the British Virgin Islands and from other colonized territories in the Caribbean? Is there?
Yes. And yeah, good question. Yeah, yes, they are. So, for example, just as we had recently the Caribbean Studies Association Conference, led by President Dr. Tuzio Kamina Davies, that some of the individuals of us who have been working together. So in the 2020, when I was putting at the UPR for the Virgin Islands, I was also helping a person from Bonaire to essentially, and others, say Martin and other places where as they prepare their country reports. So there's a lot of coalescing, there's a lot of across the territory. And then I did not mention, but there's now the permanent forum for people African descent at the United Nations. And that was a collective, myself and a gentleman out of Sweden, and then it was a global effort. It was folks from all over the world actually came together to essentially push the United Nations establish a permanent entity for an annual basis for persons to raise issues of discrimination, having the country answer to it and make recommendations as well as for actions. And then even through the University of Virgin Islands, there's been a lot of many years that we've had a lot of coalescing, different initiatives, educationally and the like. And particularly, and so as I'm going to be rounding up again my engagement over the UPR process. My hope this time around too is to get more Virgin Islanders involved in the process. But yes, there's definitely collaboration across the Caribbean. I also the States. Even at the conference, there was persons from the States as well. And there's some collective efforts for persons stateside. The gentleman Obi who teaches African literature, history. Please collaborate with my organization. So I'll be offering collaboration with this organization, these Saturday workshops on curriculum, on decolonization, African history, and the like. So there's definitely collaboration. There could be more, but there's some collaboration.
Yeah, I think there's some collaboration on the organizational level, but that needs to be translated into an institutional level. And what I mean by that, I think at some point the University of the Virgin Islands had some kind of an extra outlet in St. Martin. I'm not sure how well that is working up to this point. But we hardly see any kind of a cultural exchange of professors from the Caribbean into the Virgin Islands. You know, and I'm talking about that collaboration on the institutional level. At one point, I think Dr. Hollis Liverpool, whom we know in the Calypso world as Chucklas, worked at the University of the Virgin Islands for a while. I don't think that ended in a way that many people that relationship ended in a way that many people in the Virgin Islands were satisfied with. So there has to be, beyond the communication on the organizational level, because there's communication, for instance, between the organizations that are advancing the call for reparations. There's definitely communication between those organizations. But on institutional level, where do we see the Department of Agriculture in St. Croix get involved with the Department of Agriculture over there in Trinidad and Tobago and see what circumstances that they can work out to build sustainable agricultural products here in St. Croix, or communicating with the people in Dominica? You know, that is not happening on the institutional level. The agriculture fair is one of the biggest programs here in the Virgin Islands. It's bigger than Carnival, okay? And we do see people come in from the island to bring their produce and stuff like that, and we get to sample what comes from the other areas. But once that is over, it's done. We don't hear from it again until next year. So we got to think in terms of that continuous communication and collaboration, and we got to think of translating it into an on the institutional level, where our institutions get involved. We know how to expect this on a daily basis, and we can identify the extent to which we see growth of the people, the welfare of the people being developed out of it.
Thank you so much. At this point, Jeremy, did you have something to add really quick, or are we good to start wrapping up?
No, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so at this point, I want to thank you all for participating. Thank you for the audience. Thank you to the audience for attending. It's been a really excellent session. And so at this point, I'd like to wrap up, but thank you again. And I also want to say that on September 29th and 30th, we are having the closing for our tribunal in New York. If you can attend in person, that would be great. But I believe it will also be live streamed, so there's the opportunity to participate in that way as well. So thank you all very much. Again, have a great day. Have a great night for wherever you are. Have a great rest of your day or evening. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye.